This episode is supported by FX's Grotesquerie, a new series from executive producer Ryan Murphy. Heinous crimes unsettle a small community, and the local detective feels these atrocities are eerily personal, as if someone or something is taunting her. Starring Niecy Nash-Betts, Courtney B. Vance, Leslie Manville, and Travis Kelce. FX's Grotesquerie premieres September 25th on FX. Stream on Hulu.
Listen closely. That's not just paint rolling on a wall. It's artistry. A master painter carefully applying Benjamin Moore Regal Select eggshell with deftly executed strokes. The roller lightly cradled in his hands, applying just the right amount of paint. It's like hearing poetry in motion. Benjamin Moore, see the love.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. You can follow the Red Treehouse on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and X at Red Treehouse Pod. And if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. Important note: sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Growing up, I was like most kids, scared of the dark. But where lots of kids are afraid of walking into or falling asleep in a dark room, I was afraid of dark staircases. I spent my childhood living in a multi-family home in Brooklyn, New York, and I have some great memories from that time of my life. Wiffle ball in the street, block parties, and lots of time with my family. But there is one thing that wasn't so great: the dark spiral staircase in the middle of the house. Picture with me a dimly lit, tightly wound staircase that ran from the basement to the top floor. There was a small landing on each of the floors, and the only light came from a wall sconce at each landing. The lights cast an eerie, orange glow that dissipated as you moved from floor to floor. If I'm honest, the staircase was the stuff of nightmares, and always scared the shit out of me. But here's the thing: the staircase was scary enough, but the house was also haunted. We'll explore this in an upcoming episode of the Red Treehouse, but for now, I'll say this: I was terrified of the Cuco, the Puerto Rican version of the Boogeyman. What made the Cuco so damn scary was you never knew where he would show up, and he was always a threat to get you. You know where I always thought he would show up? The spiral staircase. And you can imagine the overwhelming panic of running up the stairs, narrowly escaping his clutches, getting to the top floor landing, only to find the door was locked. Recently, I started thinking about El Cuco and wondering if other cultures and areas of the world have their own version. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're going to explore the Cuco and various cultural expressions of the Boogeyman. Is the Boogeyman real? And why are children across the world so afraid? I'll share the details. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. did you know that there is a technical term for fear of the boogeyman? It's called bogophobia, and it's characterized by a person experiencing a, quote, very high amount of anxiety from merely thinking of the boogeyman, let alone actually seeing a depiction of one. In fact, their anxiety may be so intense that they may even endure a full-blown panic attack as a result of it. End quote. And did you know the word boogeyman means frightening specter? In a general sense, the boogeyman is a, quote, mythical creature used by adults to frighten children into good behavior, end quote. Depending on the country and culture of origin, the boogeyman may have different characteristics and features. But what tends to be a common feature of the boogeyman legend is he is often used as a warning to unruly children. Something like, you better behave, or the boogeyman will get you. The exact origins of the boogeyman are near impossible to trace, but some descriptions go back over 500 years. In some ways, the boogeyman served a practical purpose. Rather than explain to a child the potential consequences of walking into the road or wandering into the nearby woods, a parent could simply warn them to avoid going into those areas lest they fall into the clutches of the boogeyman. But not all kids are afraid of the boogeyman because parents or grandparents have scared them. In fact, some believe in and are afraid of the boogeyman simply because they have an imagination. It's difficult to definitively describe what the boogeyman looks like because it's said that he can take on any form. Some commonalities include sharp teeth, long claws, and red eyes. And he is thought to be a ghost, demon, witch, or animal-like creature with fangs, horns, and hooves. And the boogeyman can wage psychological and emotional warfare on a person by moving in the shadows, tapping on window panes, scratching on doors, floors, and walls, and revealing its glowing eyes in a pitch-black room. That shadow figure you saw out of the corner of your eye just might have been the boogeyman. There's something else about the boogeyman, something interesting. There are different types and categories of boogeyman. The first is the boogeyman that punishes children for misbehaving and wants to teach unruly children a lesson by scaring them. The second type of boogeyman protects the innocent and punishes the guilty, regardless of age. And the third type of boogeyman is violent, and he exists solely for the sake of violence, to steal children and eat them. Perhaps the scariest version of the boogeyman is the one who appears as your deepest, darkest fear. One article stated, quote, "In many cases, he has no set appearance in the minds of adults or children, but is simply a non-existing embodiment of terror." End quote. Think of it this way. What scares you the most? Picture that thing, whatever it is, coming for you. That's the boogeyman. The boogeyman is said to have numerous powers and abilities. Let's explore 3 of them. The first is nightmares. Because the boogeyman can take on just about any form or shape, he can enter your dreams and turn them into nightmares. He is cunning, ruthless, and manipulative, and can induce anxiety, paranoia, overwhelming fear, and terror in his victims. The second is power over darkness. There's a reason so many kids fear the dark. The boogeyman is said to haunt the darkness. Not only that, but he can also manipulate darkness and affect the physical world around us. even scarier, when hiding in the shadows, the boogeyman can't be seen. He can only be felt, unless he makes his presence known. That dark corner on the far side of your bedroom could very well be hiding the boogeyman. And that seemingly irrational fear of not looking under your bed may not be so irrational after all. The third is power over fear. Like plugging in an appliance to give it power, the boogeyman thrives and feeds on fear. The more fearful you are of him, the more powerful he becomes. This is what makes the boogeyman so damn scary. He not only feeds on your fear, but he knows them as well. And he can use those fears to his advantage, manipulating your dreams, playing mind games, and playing tricks in both the darkest recesses of your room and your mind. One article stated, quote, "The boogeyman can create fear in any shape or size, along with create the manifestations of fear or corrupted pleasant dreams pulled from the mind of a sleeping entity for the boogeyman to control." End quote. Depending on where you are in the world, the boogeyman may take on an entirely different form, abilities, and name. Let's explore the boogeyman across the world. In Puerto Rico, I already mentioned El Cuco. This thing scared the shit out of me as a kid. I didn't know where he was, what he was doing, or when he was going to show up. Growing up in a Puerto Rican home, El Cuco was like family. Except instead of coming over for dinner and hanging out, he hid in my closet, or in the shadows waiting to jump out if I didn't fall asleep fast enough. I remember sleeping with my back to the wall, and if I turned to face the wall, the covers immediately went over my head. In Brazil, the boogeyman is known as a cuca and is depicted as a female human alligator hybrid, or as an old lady carrying a sack. Like El Cuco, parents warn their kids to fall asleep quickly, or a cuca will come get them and turn them into soup. In Mexico, the boogeyman is depicted as La Llorona, or the Crying One, and she is the ghost of a woman wearing a white dress. La Llorona is said to roam near bodies of water, grieving the loss of her children, who she drowned after discovering the infidelity of her husband. After regretting her actions, she drowned herself and is now condemned to wander the earth as a form of purgatory. Parents warn their children not to wander into the dark or near rivers, lakes, or streams, or else La Llorona will snatch them forever. Other parts of the world also warn of La Llorona, with varying iterations of the legend. Some countries place wooden crosses above the thresholds to keep her spirit at bay. But those unfortunate enough to see her face to face will disappear to the afterlife forever. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the boogeyman is depicted as a tall man wearing a heavy black coat and black hood or hat which hides his face. When warning their children that he will get them, parents will sometimes hit the bottom of the table with their hand or knee as a warning sign. Unlike other iterations of the boogeyman, the tall man doesn't eat or harm children. Instead, he takes them away to an undisclosed location to scare them. In Canada, the boogeyman is known as the 7 o'clock man, and he is depicted as an old man with a large sack hung over his shoulder, a sack to put children into. Parents warn their children to get to bed by 7 o'clock, or else the 7 o'clock man will eat them. And finally, in Syria, the boogeyman is depicted as King Richard the Lionheart. Not limited to Syria, parents warn their children to go to bed on time, or King Richard the Lionheart will snatch them. His picture has been used as a boogeyman in certain parts of the Middle East for centuries. Something interesting about the boogeyman. In some instances, he is the embodiment of the devil. In the United States, there are various iterations of the boogeyman, including the Jersey Devil, who is believed to stalk the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. The Jersey Devil is depicted as having a horse's head, bat wings, cloven hooves, and a serpent's tail. Recent decades have seen the boogeyman show up in film, including some of the most iconic horror movies in film history. The first, and arguably the most iconic, is Michael Myers. In the original 1978 classic by John Carpenter, he is referenced as the boogeyman several times. And throughout the movie, he stalks teenagers in the shadows outside and inside. A seeming metaphor for the harsh reality that evil doesn't check itself at the doors of their suburban homes. Michael Myers is the ultimate film boogeyman. The second is Freddy Krueger, the villain in the Nightmare on Elm Street movie franchise. He shows up in your dreams and turns them into nightmares, all while you do your best to run away as quickly as possible. But no matter how far you think you've gone, his homemade glove with knives for fingers is always closer than you'd like. The third is Jason Voorhees, the vengeful, even tragic killer in the Friday the 13th movie franchise. Jason stalks the campground of Camp Crystal Lake, luring unsuspecting campgoers and counselors to a sudden and violent demise. And finally, we have Pennywise, the embodiment of evil from the creative mind of Stephen King. Pennywise preys on the kids of Derry, Maine, transforming himself into their deepest, darkest fear. The murderous clown from It, Pennywise encapsulates the ethos of the boogeyman. Let's consider some encounters with the boogeyman. Reddit user Kiss Nation wrote, quote, "This has been eating me up on the inside for a while, mainly because I'm curious as to what this was. For context, I'm 18 years old. This comes into play later. A few months ago, when I was in bed around 10:30 p.m., I had this weird experience. I remember it clearly. The hall light was on, my door was open, and a black figure was staring at me. It looked very human-like, but all I could see were its shoulders and head, with short, scraggly hair hanging in front. Basically, picture a male version of Samara from The Ring." At this point, I was still in bed pretending to be asleep, and I was wearing an eye mask that I could see underneath of, which is how I even saw this thing. But the moment I looked at it, it quickly sprung back and shut my door without a noise. Note, I always sleep with my door shut, mainly because the dark hallway creeps me out, so I did not have the door open during this encounter. Now my door is creaky, and the handle makes a loud click sound when the door is closed. Neither of these things happened, though. I asked both my parents the next morning if either of them peeked in my room, both of which said no. I was a little weirded out, but simply pushed it off as nothing more than sleep paralysis, which does occasionally happen to me. The only difference is that in my normal sleep paralysis episodes, I hallucinate a tarantula crawling along wherever I'm looking at. not a humanoid figure. No biggie, right? Wrong. The next night, around the same time, I saw the figure peeking in my door again. This time, though, it was holding something. I couldn't make out exactly what it was since everything was blacked out, but it looked like a bottle. But when I looked at it this time, it didn't go away. Instead, I was able to move my arm, and then it left, quietly shutting my door once again. This told me that it wasn't sleep paralysis, since I could move. It hasn't happened again since then, but lately I've been thinking about it. I've been watching a lot of urban legend videos, but one regarding the Boogeyman caught my attention. The description of the Boogeyman was eerily like this figure, the only difference being the Boogeyman wears a hooded cloak, and this thing didn't have one. Another thing is the Boogeyman usually goes after children, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm 18. Does anyone else here think it could have been the Boogeyman? Or something else? I'm not sure, and I still don't know. End quote. The next Boogeyman encounter comes from a deleted Reddit user. Quote, Boogeyman almost implies it is fake, but this is what scared me until I was about 17 or 18. I'm 24 now, and for all I can tell, it was as real as I can remember. It started when I was about 8 or 9. We had this giant sinkhole near my house, and we called it Devil's Pit because all these ghost stories surrounded it. My friend and I went there one day in the afternoon just walking around, and we went in the middle. The whole place has trees on the slopes and a few in the middle, but the middle is generally open. And we both stopped dead in our tracks as we saw this creature that was just fucked up beyond recognition. If I think about it now, it looked like a cross between a giant raccoon and a bobcat with a short stubby tail. This thing howled and hissed at us, and we looked at each other frozen. But when we turned back to where the creature stood, it disappeared. Then, we noticed its tracks led up one of the slopes, but instead of checking it out, we bolted, scared shitless. I thought that would be the last time I would see that thing, but I was wrong. Ever since that night, I could hear scratching and howling noises outside my windows. My bedroom was located near our screened-in porch, and it's not like the howling was loud enough to wake my parents or sister. It was just loud enough for me to hear. My friends who slept over wondered what the hell it was, and every time I told my mom, she would just say, "Don't worry." It wouldn't happen every night, and it would only happen every few months or so. The next physical encounter I can recall with this creature was years later when I was 15 or 16. My friend and I went out one night and went to this building lot just to mess around. The house next to the lot had a dog, and we heard it growling. So we decided to leave because we didn't want it to bark at us and wake up the neighborhood. We were a few blocks away when we heard that dog barking again. We turned to look back around, and maybe 10 to 20 feet away from us, we saw the creature again. It looked exactly the same as what I remember the first time. This time, it was under a street lamp, and my friend was scared, and I quickly told him I'd seen it before. It just stared at us, and we ran home as quickly as possible, looking back every few seconds until we were far enough to see that it was gone. We got back to my house scared, and eventually calmed down, got some food to eat, and waited. An hour went by, and we were sitting in my room when I heard the familiar scratch and low howl. I'm not even sure if you can call it a howl, just a low noise At that point, we were scared, and my friend was confused because I told him briefly what happened to me. The scratching and howling went on for a little bit longer, and we eventually fell asleep." End quote. And finally, Reddit user SamSoBuff1215 wrote, quote, "As a kid, it was the crawler. I grew up in a typical one-story but long house. Long house meant long hallway. My room was approximately halfway down the hall. As usual, some nights nature would call, and I would have to go out into the hallway to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night. Down either side of the hallway were many doors: my sister's room, parents' room, study, and various closets. I always had this fear that I would see the crawler dart from one door to another across the hall. I had nightmares about it, and in my nightmares, it was usually grayish white, and its knees or back legs were bent the opposite way. Its face was never anything more than two reflective eyes, much like a cat or a dog. No nose, no mouth. It was terrifying." End quote. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, it's fascinating to think people all over the world believe in some form of the Boogeyman, and that his behaviors are consistent from culture to culture, to scare kids into behaving and following instructions. Look, I don't know if the Boogeyman is real, but I do know the fear of the Boogeyman certainly is. Because even now, as a grown man, I'm not sure you could pay me to walk that dimly lit spiral staircase from my childhood all those years ago. After all this, we're still left with these questions. Is the Boogeyman real? And why are children across the world so afraid? I shared the details. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.